In this tutorial, we're going to make a simple job search app that's powered by an external API. Hi, this is James from Junior Developer Central and welcome to this full stack app tutorial where we're going to be making this job search app. And so this application's a little bit different from the other projects that we've been doing because we're not actually going to have a database on the back end with lots of different jobs set up. We're actually going to get all of our data from a third-party API. But we'll still need to build a backend server, as you'll see when we get onto that part of the application. So let's just give it a little demo to see what you can do with the job search app. There's just two fields to fill out on the form, and you just literally put in a search term such as PHP, for example, and then a location. I'll just type in London. And then when you submit the form or hit the search button, you'll see it comes back with some job titles that have been matched with the keyword that I've entered, and also it's got some salaries and the location and some information about the job so we can actually browse it and add a link to go to the job itself. So these are real jobs from job sites, and the country at the moment is set to the UK, but this will actually work depending on what location you're in. There's some geolocation in there to make sure that the jobs are being pulled from the relevant country that you're browsing from. And just to prove that they're real jobs, if we click on one of the links, you'll see I'm taken to monster.co.uk for this example, and here is the real job that we've just pulled information for, and I could apply for that if I so wanted to. So that's pretty much the application in a nutshell. As I say, it's a bit different from the other full stack applications we've done, and we'll learn some things about working with APIs and also building a front end from scratch. So with that said, let's crack on and start with building our backend server that we can use to power our job search app. So the first thing we need to do is actually get a key for the API that's going to be pulling our job listings, and the API that I actually used in the demo example a moment ago was the Adzuna API. You might have seen it flash up when we clicked to go to the job listing itself. So if you just head on over to developer.adzuna.com and you can sign up for a free account, you just need to register with your email address to get access to the API itself, and once you've logged in you'll actually get a dashboard a bit like this. And if you head over to the API access details section, this should be set up automatically for you. You'll get two bits of information. You'll get an application ID and also an API key, which we'll be actually using to send our requests to Adzuna to pull that job listing data back into our own application. So you might be thinking, if we've got an API where we can just make calls to get this job information, can't we just plug that into the front end? Why do we need a backend server to actually make these requests? Well, hopefully it should be clear that you've got an application ID and an application key, your API key, to make these requests, and you kind of want to keep those private. You don't really want to be exposing those on your network requests on your front end, because someone could just take your details, your ID and API key, and in this scenario it probably wouldn't be much of an issue. But obviously if you've got a service that you're paying for, or a service that you're using that's got sensitive information, like email addresses perhaps, you want to keep all this information private so that someone can't misuse your API keys. So at this point I'm going to assume that you've got your Adzuna application ID and API key, and I'll show you where to put those in just a second when we start building out the server and the backend to send our requests to them. Okay, so the first thing we're going to do, we're just going to head over to the terminal and create a new project. So we'll just call this job search app project, for example. And let's just navigate into that folder. And then I'm just going to pull up Visual Studio Code so we can start writing some stuff into this project. And I'll just grab a terminal from here so we can start doing our terminal work in here as well. And we'll make two folders as we have done with other projects before, and one will be for the API and the other one will be for the front end. We can call it app or something else, it's up to you really, but we're going to start working on the API to start off with. I'm just going to initialize this as an npm project, so npm init and -y to accept all of the defaults, which will create a package.json file in there, and we can now add some dependencies. So we're going to use two things for this project. We're going to use Axios, which is actually going to be sending the requests to the Adzuna API, and the other thing we'll actually install as well is Chalk, just for a bit of styling of the output on the command line. Oops, and npm I Chalk. So that's pretty much all we need for our dependencies. So let's create a couple of files that we'll use for our backend API. Just create a file called config, and I'm going to put some configuration data in there in a second. And we'll also create a file called index.js, which is basically going to be the server that will run our code and proxy our requests from the front end to Adzuna. So let's first of all head over to the config.js file. And in there, we're just going to do a module.exports, which will export some data for us to use in our index.js file. And we want a few things in there. We want to export the app ID, and we also want to export the API key from Adzuna. And just in an effort to keep this really secure, or as secure as it can be, we'll take those as environment variables. So when the API itself starts up, it'll read this config file, and from there we'll actually take those values from the exported command line environment variables and insert them into our config file. So we'll see how that works when we actually start up the API itself, but let's just set this here for now. And the other thing we need to do is also get the base URL of the API from Adzuna, and so I'm just going to grab that and copy it in here. So this is actually in the documentation for Adzuna, and you'll see that on the account when you log in. And also, there are some parameters that we need to set to make a query to Adzuna, and we'll be sending like the search and the technology that the user's searching for, and also the location of where they're looking from the front end. So those would be some parameters that we'll provide, but there are some other ones that we actually need to ensure are already there. And they're things like the results per page and what type of data we want to receive back from Adzuna. So let's just save that as a config file. So with that set up, let's head over to the index.js file so we can start coding up the actual server that will be running. And in previous full stack application tutorials that we've done, we've used Express as our framework to receive and send HTTP requests and to serve content. We're going to go really basic for this tutorial, and we won't use Express at all because it does seem a bit overkill for just sending a request with Axios. But we still need to be able to receive requests from the front end, so we'll use the basic HTTP create server functions that are available within the Node framework libraries. So let's just import that to start off with. We'll say create server, and we're going to require that from HTTP, and there is actually a function there called create server. And the other thing we'll need, because we need to parse the URL that comes through, in particular the search parameters that are being provided, the get parameters. So we'll need the URL library as well. And we'll also import Axios at this point as well, spell it correctly. And save that in a variable called Axios. There we are. And we'll also get a copy of chalk as well here so that we can output some different colors onto the command line. And also we need to grab that config as well, and we'll just say require .config. There we are. So that's all the dependencies imported, all the libraries ready for us to go. We do need some additional information though. With Express, it takes care of all of the things like headers and the content type that we've been sent back with each request, but we're doing it manually here, so let's create an object that contains all the headers that we want to send back to the front end when we've got a response from the Adzuna API. So we'll say headers is equal to, and we need to set the content type, and we'll be sending back some JSON, so we'll say application JSON is the content type. And we also want to set up our cores as well, so this request can be made from a different domain, which is quite important while we're testing here at the moment, because the front-end code will actually be running on a different port to the back-end code, which causes a cross-domain issue. And we'll just make sure that the methods that are allowed are get. So the next thing I'm going to do, I'm just going to create a helper function which will actually decode the parameters from the URL when it comes in. And we did a tutorial a few weeks ago about this on the Junior Developer Central YouTube channel, and it was basically a case of converting a search params object into an actual object that has the keys and values accessible as it would be in a normal JavaScript object. So for example, if we've got something like this coming in as our search parameters, so the search is equal to, well, in the example we said PHP, and the location is equal to, say, London. So we want to convert that into an object so that we can access each of those properties. So we'll do that with this function here. And as I said, this is what we did in the tutorial a little time ago. So we'll say the search params is a parameter, and we'll convert that into an array. And we want it from the search params.keys. And then with that, we'll put it into a reduce function where we've got the accumulator and each of the individual keys. and then we'll send that back as an object with the accumulator properties that are already in there. So this is the existing keys, and then we'll do a computed property, and we'll say search params dot get key is the actual value of it. So let's just make sure we've got a blank object to start off with, and that should be all good. I think I've got my braces in the wrong place there, so we just want it there. That looks a bit better. So now we've got that helper function, let's actually set up our server, which will accept requests and then send them off to the Adzuna API. So we'll just create a variable called server, and we'll use the create server function that we've imported, which is very similar to what you get in the Express framework, where you get a request and a result object. And so from that request object, we'll get the URL and save it into a variable. And we'll use the URL parse function that we imported a second ago as well. And URL. And then with that, we'll send it to the decoded parameters function. So decoded params is equal to decode the params, and we need to convert that into a new URL search params object, and we'll pass in the request URL dot search. So what we should have in the decoded params object now, if we passed in PHP and London as our search and location, we should have something that looks a little bit like this. It'll be a string, obviously, and the location will be London. So now we can pick out those properties and use them when we're generating our Axios request. So we'll actually just destructure those into their individual variables. So we'll have search, location, and we will actually be sending another one as well, which is country, but we might not be able to actually get that country parameter out, as I'll explain when we start looking at the front end. So we'll just set it to a default value of GB. Of course, if you're in the US or somewhere else, you can set it to whatever country code that you feel is appropriate. And we'll just send the decoded params object there so that it'll just destructure it into those individual variables. So here comes the fun bit. We actually need to construct our target URL that we're going to send to Adzuna. So we need to call on quite a few different bits of information to generate this, but we'll say the target URL is equal to the config.base URL, which, if you remember, we set up at the start of this section. And we also then need to get the country code. So that country that we just destructured from the decoded params, if it's there, we'll get the user's country, but if not, it'll default to GB. And I'm just going to set that to lowercase just to be on the safe side here as well. And then we need to add in those base params that we set up in the config as well. And again, all this is in the Adzuna documentation. So base params, oops, there we are. Now here's where we're actually going to set our application ID and also our API key as well. So we need to get those from the config, but we'll pass those as parameters. So we'll say the app ID is equal to config dot app ID, and then also the app key is equal to the config dot API key. And then finally, just to finish off this target URL, we actually need to add the two things that are quite important for the search to actually work. What is the user actually looking for, and what location are they looking in? So we specify that with the what parameter, so the what get parameter, and that will be the search that's been passed in. And the location is specified by a parameter called where. And again, all this information is actually given to you via the Adzuna API. So you'll just have to trust me that it's in there, but you can obviously go and check and see what parameters are available when you're making those requests to them. So that is pretty much our target URL constructed. And now we're in a position where we can send that data to Axios in a safe manner, because all of our private information, like the app ID and the API key, is on our server, so no one can see that within the front end. So we'll do a quick check to just make sure that we're actually getting a get request come through, and we can ignore any other types of requests that are coming through. And we'll do a quick console.log with a chalk output. We can just set it as green, and we'll just say the we're proxying a get request to, and let's just output the target URL in there as well, just so we can debug it if we need to. So now we're ready to send our request. Let's send the call with Axios, and we just use the axios.get method and send it the target URL. And we get a promise back from that. So if we've got a good response, that will be in the then part of the promise that comes back. So we can then write our headers to the response, and we'll send a status code of 200 back to say it's a good response. And we will also send that data too as well. So we'll say res.end, and then we'll just stringify the response.data. So the response.data will actually hold the information that's come back from Adzuna, and we'll pass it back as JSON data so our front end can consume it. Of course, we want to catch any errors that come back there as well. Let's just say error. And we'll do a similar thing. We'll actually log out some information here with chalk.red and just say error. And we also want to write the head as well, because otherwise the application will just hang. The network request won't actually ever finish because we need to make sure the front end knows that it's closed. So we'll write head, but we'll send a status code of 500 back just to let them know that it was an error. We could do some more investigation as to what went wrong and send different responses. But for our purposes, it should be okay. And if something seriously has gone wrong, then a 500 would indicate that there is a server error. So let's just actually send the data back as well, in case that's got some useful information in there. So that's pretty much all we need to do for our Axios request. So when we've got some data come in and there's no problems, we'll send that off to the target URL. And we just need to really set the server listening when we run this bit of code. So we'll listen on port 3000 and just set a callback just to let the user or the admin know that this is running okay. So chalk.green, and we'll just say server listening. And that will pretty much complete our backend service. So it might be worth at this point just running it and just seeing if we've got any errors. So we'll just say npm start, which will run the index.js file. Oh, and oops, we didn't actually create a start file, so we'll just run the index file directly here for the moment. So node index.js, and the server is listening. So let's probably test this with Postman. Actually, we could probably test it in the browser because we're just sending a GET request. So let's pull up a browser window. And if we go to local host and 3000, and then pass in a search parameter, and we'll just say PHP, and the location is London. If we hit enter now, yeah, we can see that JSON data has come back, and we could probably see that there's some information about the jobs that we've just found. And if we look in the console of our Visual Studio Code app, yeah, we can see that we've got the request being sent, and we can see that full URL that's been generated. So that looks all good at this point. So with that set up, let's close everything down. We can leave the actual API or the backend script rather running in the background here. We'll just open up a new terminal window. And if we log into, or move directory rather, to our front end, let's actually start setting up the front end application that will consume the service that we've just created. Okay, so I'm just going to do the same thing that I did with the backend. I'll set up this as an npm project, so I'll init it and just accept all of the defaults there. This time, if we actually go to the package.json file, oh no, we're in the API there. Let's go to front end. We'll actually set a couple of scripts up in here, but there's one dependency that I'm going to use for the front end, and that's parcel, the parcel bundler. And this is a really awesome piece of kit that will basically take all of our developer dependencies, like things like Sass and our JavaScript, and it'll bundle it all into one thing. So we don't need to worry about any sort of build steps or anything like that. Parcel will take care of it for us. So let's just install that now. Okay, so with Parcel install, let's actually set up an npm run script, a start script, so that we can just run that from the command line with one single command. And what we're actually going to do is within our Parcel package that we've just installed, we can access the CLI from the Parcel bin folder, and we're just going to build the index.html file, which we'll set up in a second, and that will essentially watch that file for any changes, convert any Sass or JavaScript files into a bundle, and it will display it in the browser for us. Of course, if you've got Parcel installed globally, you could just change this to parcel index.html, but it's kind of nice having it as a start script, because if someone else installs your project, they can just run npm start and everything will work. So with that being said, let's actually create that index.html file, and this will be the root of our front-end project. There's only one page anyway, but this is where everything kind of kicks off. So let's put a default skeleton page in there, and put some placeholder text for the title. So let's just call it something like job search app, for example. And I will actually include Bootstrap as a link via its CDN. And the only reason for doing this rather than including it with Parcel or another npm package, for example, is because I don't really need any of the JavaScript that comes with it. So it seems a bit of a waste to get that all bundled up if we're not actually going to use it. Okay, so we'll actually create some markup inside here, which will have all of our assets that will be on the page. So we'll have a header element, and this will basically contain pretty much everything for the application bar the search results at the bottom. And I'll create a div in there with a class of container, and we'll put a h1 in. And feel free to sort of change any of this text as you're going along. I'll just call it job search app at the top there. And I had a really cheesy headline in there saying, find your perfect job today, or something like that. Perfect John, perfect job, maybe. And we'll create a form in here as well. So this will be the form that actually has the inputs for search and location. So all I need to do really is give that an ID, and we'll just call it search form in this example. We don't need a method because we'll catch it with JavaScript to actually send the data that's in the form to the back end. So with that being said, let's set up those inputs. So the first one is obviously text, and it's got a class of form control, so Bootstrap class. We'll put a placeholder in there of, well, let's say job title, and also give it an ID of search, which, as you can see, sort of matches the parameter that's required for the back end to actually do the search. And also we need the location as well. Let's just copy what we've got for that in terms of form controls. And the placeholder, we'll just say location for that. And of course the ID is also location. And finally we just need a button in there as well. So we'll have that with a class of btn and btn block. Just so it spans the entire bit of the page there. And we'll just say search for that. And that pretty much completes our form and also our header section. So we'll move on to the next bit, which is basically going to be the search results. So we'll put that into a main tag, and we'll also have another container inside there as well. And there's a couple of things that we need in here. Basically, we need a placeholder element that will have our results loaded into, but we'll also put an element that will have a loading, a kind of spinner, when the front end part of the app is waiting for a response from the back end. So I'll just create that first. We'll say we'll have an element that has a class of loading element, and inside there I'm just going to put an image. And we should probably create our image folders here. So within our structure of our front-end application, let's create a new folder. And we'll just call this source, and we'll create a folder in there called, image. And what I'll actually do is copy across an SVG of a spinner that I downloaded earlier on, which will basically just insert in as a source element in here. So it will be inside source image and 45.svg, and we'll set the display property of this via our SCSS in a moment, and then we'll manipulate that with JavaScript when the application is waiting for results from the back end. So the other thing we need is another div element, which will have all of the data from the back end loaded in, and we'll do that in our JavaScript code, but we just need a placeholder element so that we know where to put those results once they've come in. And the final thing we'll do, just before we finish our template, is we're actually going to load in a JavaScript file, which will do most of the work for us. And we'll put that inside source app.js. and I will create that now so that we can start work on that in just a second. So within this app.js file, we could put all of the code for generating the data from the request from the backend, but it's probably worth, because we've got Parcel, we've got a bundler enabled, we can split this up into different modules of code into different files. So this will be the sort of main file that will load in everything, but let's first of all create some separate files that will do the specific jobs that we need for retrieving the data and generating the HTML markup that will be displayed on the page. So the first thing we'll do is create a class. Let's create another file here. Whoops, that's back in the API. So in the source folder, let's create another file and we'll call it jobsearch.js. So this we'll create a class in here which basically does most of the work for us, but it's just nice to have it as a separate file. And when we construct one of these job search classes, we're going to take in a few bits of data. First of all, we're going to take in the search form selector. So this will be the selector ID for actually finding out where the search data is coming from, which is the form that we created a moment ago. And we'll also pass in a selector for the results container. And again, that's going to be the class name of the HTML element that we created in the index file. We'll also pass in another selector as well, which will be for the loading element. There we go. And when we construct the object, we'll basically just set the this.search form to a query selector for search form selector. And we'll do the same thing for the results container. And we'll just do document.query selector, and it's the it's going to be the results container selector there, and then this loading element equals finally document query selector, and we'll set that to loading element selector. So this means when we create a new object from our job search class, we should have the properties search form, results container, and loading element all available to use throughout the rest of the class. And that will make it a little bit easier for us to work with those elements. And of course, it makes it a bit more flexible because you can just pass in different selectors for different applications that you might be using this on. So we're going to move on to setting up the geolocation for the application. So when the page actually loads, we'll run this function, and we'll just call it set country code. And we can do a bit of a geo IP lookup based on the IP address. It's not foolproof, obviously, depending on how you connect it to the internet as well. But there is an API provider called ipapi.com. And if we just pass in a URL of /JSON, what we can actually do with our fetch call, if we get our results and just convert them to JSON, results.json. In this final results object that comes back here, we can actually extract the country code from the results that come back there. So we'll just say results.country code, and we'll just set it to lowercase as well, because as I said, the backend API likes it to be in lowercase, the one provided by Adzuna. And based off that country code as well, we can work out what currency symbol we should be displaying on the front end. Unfortunately, the data that comes back from Adzuna shows you the salary that the job is offering, but it doesn't actually show you what currency they'll be paying you in. So we're going to make an assumption that if you're in the US, for example, you'll be paid in dollars, and in UK it'll be pounds, for example. And we'll just use this GeoIP to make that distinction. So we'll call another function. We haven't set this up yet, but we'll say set currency symbol. And we'll write that in just a second, but there's probably worth saying that this API, the ipapi.com, sometimes you get blocked, or sometimes it just throws an error. It doesn't work particularly well 100% of the time, so you probably wouldn't want to rely on this in production. But what we'll do is just set some defaults, so if there are any problems, we'll have the currency code or currency symbol, sorry, and the country code available already. So that's just a quick and dirty geolocation based on IP, so we can work out what currency symbol we should be displaying for the job adverts. So the set currency symbol, we haven't created that function yet, but it's something that we might, if we were making this into a larger application, need in other parts of our site. So let's actually create another file within our source, and we'll call this utils.js. And we're going to put a function in here to help us get the currency symbol, and this will be pretty basic, but we'll just call a function called getCurrencySymbol, which takes in the country code, which we've obviously retrieved from the API, and just does a bit of a lookup here. So we'll set up some currencies, and so if the country code is GB, we want to supply the pound symbol, and if it's US, of course we want dollars. Oops, make sure it's in a string. And we've also got some other options as well, so things like Australia and Canada, and we could go through and create different country options that have different currencies in this table, but I'll just keep it simple for now. And then we'll just return from the currencies object the currency that matches the country code that's been supplied in the function. So that's great. Now we've got that function that's exported from this module, and we can just go back to our job search file here, and we can just now import it from that file. So if we say import get currency symbol, from, and it's in the utils file, we can now use that function inside of our code here. So we'll just set a function up within our class, which will be pretty simple. Set currency code, and because the country code is available on the object now, or on the class rather, we can just set the set a variable called currency symbol, and it's basically equal to get currency symbol, which is that function that we've just imported, and it will be based on this .country code. So now this is the big part of our class. It's the main thing that will set up the event listener. So when someone submits the form, we actually know to send the request to the back end. So we'll call this function configure form listener, or it could be setup form listener, for example, and we'll get access to the search form. Don't forget we've got direct access to the element because we set it up in the constructor, and we'll just say add event listener. And when the form is submitted, we want to grab hold of the event that's been passed in, and we'll call the event.prevent default function just to stop it submitting the form and reloading the page. And we'll actually then just get the results container element, and we'll just set the inner HTML of that to nothing, just so if there are any search results that have already come back, we'll just clear them so the user can tell some new results have been loaded. And we're going to basically need to get the search property, so the value from the search input field and also from the location as well. And what we'll actually do, if I go back to the utils file again, I'm going to create another function in there which I'll export, and I'll call this one extract form data. And if we pass in a form object to this, what I want to do is convert the values into an array based on the form elements. So it doesn't matter how many elements are in the form, we'll create that, convert that into an array. And then in a similar way that we did with the URL params on the back end, I'm just going to convert this into an object so I can access each property individually. We'll deconstruct that into the ID and the value. So the elements property on the form will be each of the individual input boxes represented via an ID and a value. Those are the HTML attributes. So we'll spread in the accumulator from the reduce function again, and we'll set the ID, a computed property again, to the value, and just ensure that it's actually a blank object to start off with. So with that function created, we can use that in this part of our application, and if it grows as well, we can use it in other parts too, to extract data from a form and convert it into an object. So let's just use, actually first we need to import it as well. So get currency symbol and extract form data. And now down in our code here, we'll say extract form data from the search form that's set up on the class. So now we've got the what the user's searching for and the location that they're searching it from the form. We can actually send our request to the back end, and again we'll use the fetch API for that. We could probably construct this URL in a bit of a better way, but just for brevity's sake, let's just hard code it in here. So we're going to send it to the localhost 3000 API that we've got running at the moment, or the backend server that we just created. And the search value is obviously going to be equal to the search that the user's typed in, and the location is equal to the location that they've typed into the other input field on the front end. And of course we'll pass in the country code that we've determined from their geolocation lookup. And don't forget, if this was a problem, the backend was configured to accept a default value as well. Once that response has gone through, we can convert it to JSON, and then the results, we actually get a property called results come back actually, so we'll destructure that in the second then part of the promise chain, and then from that we're just going to return the results. But what we're going to do is want to actually convert them into some HTML. So we could do a loop here and go through each of the items that have come back and then generate a HTML block that has all of those details in. And we kind of will do that, but I'm actually going to call a function. So because we'll have an array here, I'm going to map this, and I'm going to say for each of those jobs that comes back, I'm actually going to send it to a function called job template. And I'm going to pass into that the whole object that's in the array, the job itself, and also the currency symbol, because don't forget we need that for displaying the salaries for the user. And then I'll just join that all back together as one big string. So then in our final part of our then promise chain, we'll basically have a string which will have all of the jobs in there. So I can just then set the results container to the inner HTML, which is the result of the jobs that's come back. So where's this job template function coming from? Well, I'm going to create a new file in our source directory, and I'll just call it templates, and it'll contain that function inside here, and we'll just say export job template. And of course there might be other templates that we're using in our app, so that's why it's good to put it into a separate file. And of course we passed in the job and the currency symbol here. And all I'm going to do from this function is return a template literal. But inside that I'm actually going to put the template that we want to display for each of the individual job listings. So here I'm just going to put in some elements with some bootstrap classes. So we're going to use the card classes, and we'll say we've got a card body. And inside that card body we'll have let's say a h4 element with a class of card title, and inside that I'm going to put the job title. So don't forget, job that's been passed in as an object is basically each of the jobs that's come back from the backend service, so we can access each of the properties that are on there. And we'll say job title is up to the currency symbol, closely followed by the job's salary max. So you can have a look at the response that comes back from the API, and you can play around with some of the data that's in there. So if you want to create your own custom template, for example, and we'll also just get the location as well. So on the job object, we've got a property called location, and there's also a property inside that called display name, which gives us a nicely formatted title of where the job is located. So finally, inside this template, we're going to set some card text as a paragraph tag, which will basically have the description in there, and close that tag. And then also we just have a link in here to the actual job itself. And on the job object again, we've got another property called redirect URL, which will send us to the place where the job is located, as you saw at the start when we demoed the app. So let's just make sure that opens in a new tab. I'll say view job, and close that link, and let's just make sure we've closed all of our divs. I should probably just indent this a little bit to make it easier to read. Oops. So we'll use this function to map each of the results and return a string that has all of this information in, and then back in the job search app, when that happens, it'll all be joined together as one block of HTML that can then be updated into the results container. So let's not forget to actually import that function into this file here. So we should be in a position now where we could actually start trying this out, but we actually need to load in the job search class that we've created as an object and call a couple of functions just to set everything up. So within our app.js file, let's import the job search class, which is in obviously the job search file. And we'll create a new job search and we'll just save that into a variable. And what we need to pass into that as part of the constructor is the elements that are going to be used for the form and also for the results and for the loading element as well. So the search form that we created on our markup before had an ID of search form, and we also created an element that had a class of result. Was it result or results? Let's just check in the template. Just result container it was. So back in our app, let's say we want to put our results inside of the result container, and then the loading elements just had a class of loading element, and that will be all passed to the constructor when the job search object is created. So we need to do two things to get everything set up. We need to call that function to set the country code. If we don't do that, the calls to the backend won't really know which country we're in, and also the currency symbol won't be set, so we need to make sure that's there. And also we need to configure the form listener as well. So configure form listener. So we're not quite finished yet, but let's try this out in the browser. So if we run the npm start command that we configured in package.json, Parse will actually build all of our dependencies into a bundle that we can actually then use in the browser. So let's head on over to localhost 1234. Okay, we've kind of got something working here. Let's see if we can actually do a search, and we'll just say PHP and London again, and let's click the search button. So something doesn't look quite right here. Let's open up our developer tools and see if we've got any errors in there, which we do. And we're getting some error in terms of the constructor here. So we seem to be creating the object okay here. Let's just check the class itself. Oh, okay, and yeah, we've created the class, but we didn't actually export it from this file, so the app.js file won't be able to import it. So let's rebuild that and then head over again and see what happens. So the page is reloaded. That's a good thing about Parcel, we don't need to worry about that. And let's submit it again. Yeah, okay, excellent. So we've got some results coming back there. So we'll have a look in the network tab. You can see, first of all, we've got our call to the geolocation service. And if you look, I don't know if that's, if we just reload the page again, yeah, we can see that's actually failing at the moment. As I say, it can be a bit temperamental. But you will, if you try this out locally, you might see that you have the country code of your particular location along with the other IP information, but yeah, that doesn't seem to be working at the moment. So let's just try another search again. Let's search for something different, JavaScript, and we'll check in a town near me, Birmingham. And so you can see the URL that's being sent to the backend, and you can see the results that are coming back. So these are the Adzuna data that's come back from the API that we've proxied, and we haven't had to supply an API key on the front end, thus we've kept it quite secure. So we're pretty much there in terms of what we had in the original application. We just want to tidy up some of the styling and also sort out the loading icon and just only show that when there's actually a request going through. So back in our code, let's sort out our styling first, and just before we do that, actually, I'll just import one other image as well, which is the hero image that we saw on the application at the start. So obviously feel free to use whatever image that you feel appropriate there. And let's create a new folder which will hold all of our styles. There isn't a huge amount of style to put into here actually, so I'm just going to create one SCSS file. But what I'll do within our template, in our head, I will just load that in after our bootstrap styles have been loaded. And this is another really useful thing with Parcel. We can just say in our source, in our SCSS, load in app.scss, and it does a few things actually. It actually creates the dependencies that are needed to do Sass conversion, and it will actually just import that as CSS when the browser actually needs it. Okay, so let's create a few rules. We had that header element at the top, and we'll give it padding of 50 pixels all the way around, and we'll then supply it with a background image, and that was inside of our image folders, and it was the business.jpg file. We'll say background size is cover, just so that image stretches across the header, and just to be on the safe side, we'll just say the background repeat is no repeat, so we don't get it repeating over and over. We'll also set the height of that as 400 pixels so that we can actually see some of that image, and the form sits in there nicely. We've also got that H2 element at the top as well, so we'll set that to a 1.2 rems just so it's of appropriate size. And for the form itself, we should probably target this individually. There's only one form on the page, so let's be a bit cheeky here. And max width is 400 pixels too, just so it doesn't take up the entire space of the header. So that's the header element. Let's just put a little bit of margin around each of those cards that are being displayed. So the card is the bootstrap class. So just a bit of top and bottom, just so the jobs are actually separated out a little bit. But the one thing I want to address is the loading element. And let's set that to a specific size. And we'll center it using a margin of 0 and auto, so it'll appear in the center of the page. And I'm actually going to set the display of that to none, so it will remove it from the page when it starts. But I'm actually going to add an additional class that can be put on top of that, which is the loading class. And when it is loading, or when that class is applied, we'll set it to have a display property of block. So let's just check that out in the browser. So that's looking a little bit more like the app that we had before, but the button is still not coming up. I think I must have mistyped the class on the button that we've got here. I did miss off BTM primary, that might do the trick. Yep, obviously you can change the color to whatever you like for that particular button. Now if we just try it again, PHP, I'll say in Worcester. So yeah, we've got the results come out, and there's a little bit more space between those results, just so that we can distinguish between each individual job. So the last thing we really need to fix is the loading element. So we've obviously hidden it, so it's not displaying at the moment, but we want to actually show it when the user submits the form. So let's go and add a couple of methods into our class. So back in our job search.js file, just before the class finishes, we'll say a function called start loading, which will basically say grab the loading element on the class list, and we're going to add the loading class, which we just configured in the SCSS a moment ago, and also a stop loading function, which does the opposite and removes the class when we want to stop that loading element from being displayed. So the only thing we need to do now really is to call those two functions when the network request is in action. At this point, we could probably say call the loading function here just before we send the fetch request, this start loading. And once we've got our results, we could say, let's do it inside. Yeah, it won't be loading here, and it won't take too long to generate those templates, so we'll say this.stop loading here. And what we might want to do as well with our fetch request, if something does go bad, we probably want to remove that loading spinner as well. So we'll just put a catch block in here as well. We'll just say stop loading if there is a problem. That's fine, we can display it, but just remove the spinner so that it doesn't perpetually go when we get an error. So let's go back to the browser and just try that out. So let's try something crazy. Let's go to JavaScript and we'll say in Manchester. So the spinner's appearing, waiting for the network request, and it goes as soon as the network request is finished. Let's try something else. And the spinner's there, and it goes as soon as the network request is finished. So you can see that the form is working, the spinner's working, we're getting our jobs coming back, and we've got all of the data from the Adzuna API so that we can actually browse those jobs. Let's see if one of them actually works. If we click View Now, it's taken us via Adzuna to the actual job that's being advertised. So there you have it, that pretty much wraps up our job search application, and hopefully that's something a little bit different from what we've been doing on the full stack apps tutorial sessions. I think it's a good example of when you've got an API that you want to protect that's mainly used for the front end, but you don't want to expose the API keys to the users. It's really quite simple just to use a bit of Node.js on the back end to proxy those requests and keep those keys safe, and ultimately allowing you to control a little bit more about what data goes to that API and possibly filtering the results that come back too. Of course, you could do things like put caching layers in front of that as well, so that once you've got a result from that API, you could hold it in some memory database like Redis, for example. And that ultimately would increase the response time and reduce the number of calls that you need to make to those third-party APIs. Of course, this session's front end was a bit different as well, and hopefully you've seen that Parcel.js is a really powerful and easy to use bundler, so you can just literally wrap up all of your dependencies and it outputs a nicely formatted bundle that you can then deploy to your live site without having to do too much configuration or thinking about it. So that's it for this video. I'll see you in the next full stack app tutorial.